In the quiet, late afternoon glow of Genoa City, tension had been building for days beneath the surface, and no one felt it more intensely than Phyllis Summers. Known for her fierce intelligence, unpredictable temper, and unwavering determination to protect her family, Phyllis had always been capable of crossing lines others wouldn't dare approach. But even by her standards, the secret she had been hiding was dangerous enough to shake the foundations of multiple lives. It began when Tessa Porter walked into Crimson Lights earlier that morning. Normally, the cafe hummed with the comforting routine of Genoa City's residents grabbing coffee, exchanging gossip, and trying to keep their complicated lives somewhat under control. But that day there was a strange tension in the air that Tessa couldn't quite place. She had come looking for Mariah Copeland, hoping to talk through some creative ideas for a new song she'd been writing, yet Mariah wasn't there. Instead, Tessa noticed something unusual on one of the cafe tables. A folder half hidden beneath a magazine, its corner peeking out like a silent invitation. Normally she would have ignored it, but when she noticed Phyllis's name on the edge of one document inside, curiosity tugged at her instincts. Tessa had always tried to avoid the chaos that seemed to follow Phyllis everywhere, but lately the red-haired force of nature had been acting strangely, guarded, nervous, even paranoid. Tessa picked up the folder, intending only to see if it belonged to someone who had left it behind. What she saw instead made her heart pound. Inside were documents, emails, and what looked like financial transfers. Large sums of money moved through accounts connected to Newman Enterprises. The paperwork hinted at manipulation, secret deals, and something even darker lurking beneath the surface. At the center of it all was Phyllis. The realization hit Tessa like a wave. If these papers were real, Phyllis had been secretly orchestrating something that could hurt several people in Genoa City. Before Tessa could fully process what she was seeing, the cafe door opened sharply. Phyllis walked in, her heels clicking with unmistakable confidence, but the moment her eyes landed on the folder in Tessa's hands, that confidence vanished. Her expression hardened instantly. "Put that down," Phyllis said coldly, striding toward her. Tessa looked up, startled by the intensity in Phyllis's voice. "I didn't mean to snoop," she said carefully, "but I think I just found something you don't want anyone to see." The cafe suddenly felt too quiet, as though the walls themselves were listening. Phyllis reached the table and snatched the folder from Tessa's hands, but the damage had already been done. Tessa had seen enough to know something was wrong. "What is this, Phyllis?" Tessa asked, her voice firm despite the tension. "These transfers, these emails, are you manipulating Newman accounts?" Phyllis's eyes flashed with anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about." But Tessa wasn't backing down. "I know what I saw," she insisted. "And if this is what it looks like, you could destroy a lot of lives." Phyllis leaned closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You should learn when to mind your own business." Tessa felt a surge of defiance. "Not when people I care about could get hurt." For a moment, neither woman moved. The tension between them thickened like a storm cloud ready to burst. Tessa thought about Mariah, about the people she loved, about the complicated web of rivalries in Genoa City involving the Newmans and the Abbotts. If Phyllis was secretly manipulating money or information behind the scenes, it could ignite a war that would ripple through everyone's lives. "I'm not staying quiet about this," Tessa finally said. "Someone needs to know." That was the moment everything changed. Phyllis's face twisted with fury and desperation, emotions colliding in a way that made her seem almost unrecognizable. Before Tessa could react, Phyllis's hand flashed through the air. The sharp sound of the slap echoed through the cafe like a gunshot. Tessa staggered back, stunned, her hand instinctively rising to her cheek. The shock of the moment froze everything around them. For a split second, even Phyllis seemed startled by her own action. But then she leaned forward and delivered the 6 words that would haunt Tessa long after the sting faded. "You should have never looked there." The sentence hung in the air like a threat. Tessa slowly lowered her hand from her cheek, her eyes blazing now not with fear but with determination. "You just proved I was right," she said quietly. Phyllis tried to regain control, smoothing her hair and clutching the folder tightly. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she insisted. But Tessa shook her head. "No," she replied. "I think I understand perfectly. You're hiding something big, and now you're scared it's coming out. The two women stood facing each other in the center of crimson lights, the weight of their confrontation pressing down like gravity. Phyllis knew the situation was spiraling beyond her control. If Tessa spoke to Mariah, or worse, if the information reached someone like Victor Newman or Jack Abbott, the consequences could be explosive. Meanwhile, Tessa realized she had just stepped directly into the middle of one of Genoa City's most dangerous secrets. The slap had been more than an act of anger, it was a warning. But instead of silencing her, it had hardened Tessa's resolve. She looked directly at Phyllis and said, "You can threaten me all you want. I'm not letting you get away with this." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Phyllis's face. She had always relied on intimidation, manipulation, and sheer force of will to control situations. But Tessa was proving harder to intimidate than expected. As the silence stretched between them, both women understood that this confrontation was only the beginning. The secret Tessa had discovered was like a spark dropped into dry grass. Sooner or later, it would ignite something far bigger than either of them could control. And when it did, the fallout would ripple across every corner of Genoa City. And in that moment, with the sting of Phyllis's slap still lingering and those 6 shocking words echoing in her mind, Tessa realized that the truth she had uncovered might change everything. The silence that followed the confrontation at Crimson Lights felt heavier than anything Tessa Porter had ever experienced in Genoa City. The sting on her cheek was still fresh, but what burned even more was the realization that Phyllis Summers had crossed a line she couldn't easily come back from. Tessa had seen anger from Phyllis before, everyone in town had, but this felt different. This wasn't just anger. This was fear. Phyllis stood there gripping the folder so tightly that the papers inside crinkled. Her mind was racing. For years, she had built a reputation as someone who could outmaneuver almost anyone in Genoa City. She had gone up against the powerful, the ruthless, and the manipulative, and often won. But this situation was different because it was spiraling in a way she hadn't predicted. Tessa wasn't someone she could easily control or silence. "Listen carefully," Phyllis said, her voice suddenly quieter but more intense. "You're blowing this out of proportion." Tessa let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Am I?" she replied. "Because it looks like you've been moving money through Newman accounts without anyone knowing. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a secret." The mention of the Newman name made Phyllis's expression tighten. Nothing involving the Newman family ever stayed quiet for long, especially when Victor Newman was involved. If Victor even suspected someone had been manipulating finances connected to his empire, the consequences could be devastating. "You don't understand the context," Phyllis insisted. But Tessa's eyes narrowed. "Then explain it." Phyllis hesitated. That hesitation alone told Tessa everything she needed to know. Across the cafe, a barista pretended to wipe down a counter while glancing nervously in their direction. Word spread quickly in Genoa City, and an argument involving Phyllis was always bound to draw attention. Phyllis noticed the attention and lowered her voice even more. "This conversation is over," she said sharply. "You're going to walk away and forget what you saw." Tessa crossed her arms. "That's not happening." Phyllis felt the familiar surge of frustration that had fueled many of her past battles. But beneath it was something she rarely admitted, even to herself. Panic. Because the truth was that the documents Tessa had glimpsed were only a small piece of something far more complicated. And far more dangerous. Weeks earlier, Phyllis had discovered irregularities in a network of transactions tied indirectly to Newman Enterprises. At first, she believed someone inside the company was quietly moving funds for personal gain. The deeper she dug, the more suspicious it looked. But the twist was that Phyllis herself had decided to intervene, quietly rerouting certain transfers to expose the corruption. Unfortunately, doing that meant manipulating the system, which made it look like she was the criminal. If the wrong person saw those records without context, it could destroy her. And now Tessa had seen them. "Look," Phyllis said, trying a different approach. "You think you uncovered something scandalous. But if you go spreading this around, you'll cause damage you can't undo." Tessa tilted her head. "Then why the slap?" Phyllis had no answer. The question hung between them like a spotlight exposing everything. Tessa finally stepped back from the table. You know what? She said quietly. I'm done arguing. I'm going to talk to Mariah. The moment she said the name, Phyllis's pulse jumped. Mariah Copeland was fiercely protective of the people she loved. If she heard that Phyllis had slapped Tessa and was hiding financial secrets tied to Newman accounts, she wouldn't stay quiet. And if Mariah started asking questions, others would start listening. Don't drag Mariah into this, Phyllis snapped. But Tessa didn't stop walking. Phyllis moved quickly, stepping in front of her. Wait. For the first time since the confrontation began, Phyllis's tone softened slightly. Please. Tessa looked surprised. Phyllis rarely asked for anything. I know you think I'm the villain here, Phyllis said. But the truth is more complicated. Tessa's expression remained cautious. Then talk. Phyllis glanced toward the cafe windows, as if expecting someone to appear outside. You can't repeat what I'm about to say, she warned. Tessa hesitated, then nodded slightly. Phyllis leaned closer. The transactions you saw are bait. Tessa blinked. Bait? Yes. Phyllis exhaled slowly. I've been tracking someone who's stealing from Newman accounts. Someone careful enough that Victor hasn't caught them yet. The name Victor carried enormous weight in Genoa City. If someone had managed to siphon money from his empire without being caught, that alone was shocking. But to catch them, Phyllis continued, I had to make it look like I was part of the scheme. Tessa processed the explanation. You're setting a trap. Exactly. But why keep it secret from everyone? Phyllis gave a bitter smile. Because if Victor knew what I was doing, he'd shut it down immediately. That part made sense. Victor Newman trusted very few people. And if the thief realized someone was watching, Phyllis added, they'd disappear before I could prove anything. Tessa's anger softened slightly, replaced by cautious curiosity. So who is it? Phyllis shook her head. I'm not certain yet. Tessa sighed. You expect me to believe all of this? Phyllis met her gaze. I expect you to think before you blow up something bigger than you realize. Tessa walked slowly back toward the table, her mind racing. Because part of her believed Phyllis. But another part wondered if this was just another manipulation. After all, Phyllis Summers had built a lifetime of complicated truths and half-truths. And even when she meant well, chaos usually followed. Tessa finally looked back at her. If you're telling the truth, she said carefully, then we're already in dangerous territory. Phyllis nodded grimly. Yes. But what neither woman realized at that moment was that someone else had already started paying attention. Across the street from Crimson Lights, inside a parked car, a figure watched through the cafe window. The confrontation. The slap. The tense conversation that followed. The observer couldn't hear their words. But they could see enough to know something explosive had just happened. And in Genoa City, secrets never stayed buried for long. Especially when they involved money, power, and the Newman Empire. Inside the cafe, Tessa took a slow breath. I'm not promising to stay quiet forever, she warned. I know, Phyllis said. But for now, Tessa continued, I'll give you time to prove what you're saying. Phyllis nodded again. Relief washed over her. But it was fragile. Because if her plan failed, if the trap didn't catch the thief soon, the evidence would still point directly at her. And if Victor Newman discovered what it looked like she had done, even Phyllis Summers might not be able to talk her way out of that disaster. Tessa turned toward the door. As she stepped outside into the fading evening light of Genoa City, the events replayed in her mind, the folder, the shocking slap, and those 6 chilling words Phyllis had spoken. You should have never looked there. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became of one thing. Whatever secret Phyllis was hiding, it was far bigger than a simple financial scheme. And sooner or later, the truth would explode. When it did, the fallout wouldn't just affect Phyllis. It would shake the entire city. This evening settled over Genoa City. The streets outside Crimson Lights were washed in the amber glow of street lamps and the fading warmth of sunset. Yet for Tessa Porter, the world felt colder than usual. She stepped onto the sidewalk with slow, measured steps, still feeling the faint sting of the slap from Phyllis Summers. But the physical pain had already faded. What lingered was the deeper shock of everything she had just witnessed. Tessa had always tried to keep her life relatively calm compared to the constant drama that swirled around Genoa City's most powerful families. She focused on her music, her relationship with Mariah Copeland, and building a future that felt stable and honest. Yet somehow, without intending to, she had just stumbled directly into a dangerous secret that might involve the most powerful name in town, Victor Newman. Back inside the cafe, Phyllis remained frozen for several seconds after Tessa left. The tension that had carried her through the confrontation finally gave way to exhaustion. She exhaled slowly and ran a hand through her red hair, trying to calm the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. The slap had been a mistake. She knew that now. Phyllis had spent years trying to rebuild parts of her reputation after countless scandals, betrayals, and mistakes. One impulsive moment of anger could undo all of that progress. Worse, it might push Tessa to do exactly what Phyllis feared. Start asking questions that could lead straight to the truth before Phyllis was ready. Phyllis sat down at the nearest table and opened the folder again. The documents inside suddenly felt heavier than paper. They represented weeks of secret investigation, careful digital tracking, and quiet maneuvering. The trail of transactions she had discovered wasn't random. It was deliberate, precise, and incredibly sophisticated. Someone had been siphoning money through shell accounts that briefly touched systems connected to Newman Enterprises before disappearing again. And the scariest part was that whoever was behind it clearly understood the Newman financial structure extremely well. Too well. Phyllis had suspected several possibilities, but each one felt equally dangerous. If the thief was an insider at Newman Enterprises, exposing them could trigger a corporate war. If it was someone outside the company manipulating the system, it meant the Newman empire had vulnerabilities no one realized. Either scenario would make Victor furious. And when Victor Newman was furious, people's lives changed overnight. Phyllis closed the folder and stared toward the cafe window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. For the first time since she began the investigation, she wondered if she had gone too far. Maybe she should have told someone sooner. Maybe she should have trusted someone else to help. But Phyllis had never been good at trusting others with sensitive information. Her instincts always pushed her to handle problems herself. That instinct had gotten her into trouble before. Across town, Tessa walked slowly through the quiet streets, her thoughts spinning. Every few steps she considered pulling out her phone to call Mariah. Normally, she would tell Mariah everything, especially something this intense. But she hesitated. Part of her wanted to believe Phyllis's explanation about the trap. Another part of her still suspected there was more to the story. Tessa stopped outside a small park bench and sat down, looking up at the deepening blue sky. The evening air carried the distant sounds of traffic and conversation, but her mind remained locked on the confrontation. She replayed the moment again, the flash of anger in Phyllis's eyes, the sudden slap, and those 6 words that had echoed with such raw warning. You should have never looked there. It hadn't sounded like a simple threat. It sounded like fear. And fear often meant the truth was even bigger than what had already been revealed. Meanwhile, back at Crimson Lights, Phyllis gathered the documents and carefully placed them back into the folder. She couldn't leave anything behind again. One mistake had already allowed Tessa to glimpse the secret. Another mistake might allow someone far more dangerous to find it. As she stood up to leave, her phone vibrated. Phyllis glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. Normally she would ignore it, but something about the timing made her uneasy. After a brief hesitation, she answered. Hello. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a low voice spoke. You're digging where you shouldn't. Phyllis's entire body went still. Who is this? She demanded. But the voice continued calmly. You thought you were being clever, moving the funds around to track the trail. Phyllis's pulse began pounding in her ears. That was information no one should know. Stop now, the voice warned. Or next time, the consequences won't be a slap in a coffee shop. The line went dead. Phyllis lowered the phone slowly, her mind racing with a terrifying realization. Whoever was behind the financial scheme knew she was investigating. And they were watching her closely enough to know exactly what had happened with Tessa. Outside in the quiet evening, Tessa finally stood up from the park bench and began walking home. She had made one decision, at least for now. She wouldn't tell Mariah everything tonight. Not yet. But she also knew something else with absolute certainty. The secret she had discovered, and the violent reaction it had triggered from Phyllis, was only the beginning of a much bigger story. And before long, the truth behind that secret would start pulling more people into its orbit. In Genoa City, that usually meant one thing. A storm was coming. And when it finally broke, no one connected to the secret would escape the fallout.